Hi, and welcome to EU Perspectives. Today, we're focusing on European health policy. With me in the studio is member of the European Parliament, Veronika Cifrová Ostrihoňová from Renew Europe. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Next, we have Arnaud Maheas, Head of Public Affairs Europe at Sandoz and Chair of Medicines for Europe's Market Access Committee. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And finally, Stefano Romanelli, Senior Government Affairs Manager at the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. Welcome.
Hello, glad to be here.
So, this March, the European Commission proposed the Critical Medicines Act, a key piece of legislation designed to tackle medicine shortages by reducing Europe's dependence on single suppliers. Ms. Ostrihoňová, let me start with you. Would you say that's the biggest priority that European legislation on medicines should focus on right now?
Well, thank you for the question and thank you for the invite. First of all, I believe that it is one of the top and key priorities. I like that, as probably you know, I don't know if the viewers do, the SAND committee became a standing committee, which was under ENVI before. So it also shows that the commitment to healthcare and to joint healthcare across the EU27 is growing stronger. I appreciate that a lot because I feel like when we look at the EU27, there are great disparities between different member states in how they can access medicines, how long it takes for them to access medicines, how long it takes to access any other health services. I come from Slovakia. And just when you look at the Central Eastern European region, the differences are vast, and that's just the CEE region. Between Estonia and Slovakia, it's going to take us years and years to be on the same level, for Slovakia to be on the same level with Estonia. Why am I saying this? Because I believe that these health inequalities are something that is destroying the European idea and the European project as a whole. Because if you have a European citizen who, just based on the postcode where he or she was born, can access or not access healthcare, which every one of us will need at some point in life, then the belief in the united Europe, in the single market, in trying to make the European sphere as comfortable and as happy for every single member, then that is being destroyed. And then the credibility of the European idea actually, I think, is endangered. So I believe that, yes, treating health inequalities is a great priority. And I believe Critical Medicines Act is a one step towards that. It's not the sole step. It's not going to solve everything. But I am very thankful that we are working on it. And I'm sure we'll have a more of a qualified discussion here and more detailed. But I see it as an important first step. And I see also healthcare, as part of the competitiveness of Europe. Of the preparedness strategy. So it all goes hand in hand, and I think it cannot be overlooked.
Mr. Maheas, from your position from the industry, would you say that reducing dependencies on a single supplier is the key issue that we should now focus on?
So, yes, it's one of the key issues for sure. And I come from the segment of the industry that supply the generic medicines. So medicines that come after the originator has lost his monopoly. And the single supplier issue is a big issue because we've demonstrated very clearly that the more suppliers you have, the more resilient you have. Basically, 2/3 of shortages in Europe are linked to a situation where you have less than 5 suppliers. Now, it's not just about the single supplier in terms of companies, but also in terms of dependency on other geographies. And if I take the example of antibiotics, and God knows we need antibiotics for even routine surgery to treat cancer. Here, Europe, and not just Europe, but the Western world has become very much dependent on China. And it is not good to be dependent on a single geography for that.
Mr. Romanelli, do you agree that addressing shortages through supplier diversification is the key goal that we should focus on now?
Well, first, let me say that the perspective I bring is the one of small and mid-sized innovative companies, and most of our companies develop rare disease therapies and ATMPs. I think that when we discuss about shortages, it's important to make a distinction between the kind of product that we speak about. If we look at the list of medicines that suffer from shortages, these are mostly medicines that are either generics or of patent medicines. Of course, there is a percentage of medicines that also innovative medicines that are on the list of critical medicines of the EU. But it's important to understand what are the medicines that suffer from shortages and to try to act on these medicines to make sure that our interventions are successful. when we speak about especially generics of patent medicines or medicines of common use where we have seen some shortages, I agree that it is important to try to diversify suppliers. And also when we procure these medicines, use a number of criteria that go beyond the lowest price, because this is one of the main issues that also makes EU or also other global partners of the EU less competitive when it comes to the purchase of these medicines. On the other hand, when we talk about medicines like rare disease therapies or advanced therapies, given their specificities, having only one supplier is part of the supply chain, because these medicines are such low volume that the risk of shortages are practically inexistent. So in that case, we should make some distinction.
Later on in the debate, we will get to the list of critical medicines that is included in the legislation. But for now, Ms. Ostrihoňová, you are a member of the Senate committee, which you already brought up. So the legislation was introduced in March. Did you already talk to your colleagues about it? What is the general idea between members of the European Parliament?
Well, the general idea is to prevent shortages of medicines as much as they occur at this point in Europe, all over Europe. And I think every European citizen, or I can speak for Slovakia, has experienced a shortage of this or that. So it basically is built on what you mentioned, the Union's list of critical medicines. We've heard that 70% is generics. And we also heard that we are dependent on Asia mostly in 60 to 80% for our medicines. So this is something that we need to work on. It also goes, and the Critical Medicines Act should go in the spirit of enhancing competitiveness. So we really need to look beyond just the price as a criteria. As was said, we have to look at availability of how fast they can deliver the medicine. Whether if there are stockpiles in one country, it shouldn't be distributed among other countries, because I think it all stems from what we also saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw that the joint procurement of vaccines was a way that actually helped certain member states to get the vaccines. If it were lost and if it were left just on the member states' competence, some of the perhaps smaller or not as rich member states would have problems buying the vaccines, because the bigger, the stronger ones would purchase them all. So I think joint procurement is a very important component of Critical Medicines Act, where, of course, we are still in the early stages of the discussion. The CMA was also debated today in the Sant committee. So we are talking about what to include, how to include, how to set the bar so it doesn't, and it shouldn't in any way punish the pharmaceutical industry. We are in consultation with many stakeholders, but it also should improve the availability of medicines that are critical to our health, as it says in the name, to all of our European Union citizens, no matter where they live, whether it's a North or a South country or an East or a West country, because then again, it goes in the spirit of enhancing the European sphere for everyone.
So are there already any key changes that you think that the Parliament will push to change from the original proposal?
I don't know about particular changes from the original proposal, because we haven't finalized that discussion yet. I can say for myself that I see the joint procurement as something that we should be discussing a little more. And I know that there isn't a complete agreement on the side of the Parliament and on the side of the stakeholders, but I believe that it is a way how to actually make medicines more accessible. So this would be a priority for me.
All right. Well, maybe let's stick to the topic for a second. So we've already mentioned that the key issue is already dependency not only on a single supplier, but also to a single region. So how realistic is it to go from Asia to manufacturing in Europe with some of the medicines that really are only produced right now somewhere else?
So my company, I was talking about antibiotics, my company Sandoz is the last company that has a very large production of antibiotics from scratch, really from the key starting material out of Austria in Tyrol. It's part of a network that includes also production in Slovenia and Spain. Very European company. We have the capacity really to serve the entire European market with penicillin, which is the most prescribed antibiotic for European patients. Now, for us, really, the first thing is to keep what we have. And I think we need a strong European manufacturing base. And for that, the Critical Medicines Act is really the first step in a good direction, because it looks at the market conditions. We mentioned procurement, joint procurement. What we need is predictability, and we also need a strong domestic market. There is no reason to produce in Europe if your own domestic market doesn't reward what you're doing. And what we're doing is serving patients, but we also play a strategic role. I was in Prague last week for a NATO summit, and this is what we discussed. In case there's a crisis, by the time it's too late to repatriate the production. So I think it's good that Europe is working on it, but I think the first step is to keep what we have. Then maybe we can look into getting what we call reshoring or building new manufacturers in Europe.
Then what are the key issues that are preventing us from keeping what we have?
It's a competitiveness issue. The production cost is very high, and the pricing pressure on the generics, the lowest priced medicines, this is our job. Our medicines are low priced. That's part of the equation. But at some point, if the price becomes lower than the manufacturing cost and the supply cost, then we have a problem. We have a market failure. And I think this is, again, what the Critical Medicines Act tries to look at, is how do we look and address market failures?
May I just join in very quickly? I think it's we shouldn't look at the Critical Medicines Act as a sole solution. And I think it's part of a solution that is bigger. And when we're talking about keeping what we have, and I completely agree, we need to keep what we have. We need to provide better environment for startups to actually become into scale-ups in Europe, because we actually have more startups here than in the US. But then the ratio changes when it goes to a bit higher level and to a scale-up, and most of them and many of them go and leave. So I come from a liberal political family, obviously. So we are thinking about how to make the business environment easier. And this is also one of the things, how to simplify. Simplification is a big word now in the European Parliament and in the European Commission of this mandate. So it doesn't mean that we have to deregulate everything, because I think some of the rules that we have are very good, but we have to make it simpler for businesses, and mainly the small and mid-scale businesses, which we are trying to keep here in Europe, also in the healthcare sector, but also in other sectors, to actually be able to flourish here. So it's not that we only look at one thing, it's all in a context of making the business area better for everyone to be able to be here, because then we all benefit.
Mr. Romanelli, you represent smaller and medium-sized businesses. So do you feel the support from the European Commission right now?
I think that especially since the beginning of this mandate, we have seen a shift towards competitiveness of the industry in general in the EU and in the pharmaceutical sector. And I think that when we read the competitiveness compass, the intentions on the Biotech Act, the intentions on the life science strategy, we see this acknowledgement of the Commission, and I can see it's the same also with many members of the European Parliament, of the importance to ensure the right ecosystem for companies. And I speak for innovative companies specifically, but I think it applies the same for generic companies in the case of healthcare. And especially there is an understanding that one of the issues that we have nowadays, especially in the pharma sector, is the challenges in indeed scaling up. There is a lot of basic research which is carried out in Europe. There is a lot of early stage clinical trials. And then when we have to move to late stage clinical trials, researchers or startups move elsewhere, often in the US, but also in other countries, because there are better conditions. It's easier to raise financing and funding. And this is a loss of the talent that we have in the EU. So a number of measures that will be proposed and are being discussed by the Commission and are currently also being discussed by the Parliament and will be taken forward in the future, go in the right direction, the same startup and scale-up strategy. And I think it's important to continue in this direction. At the moment, the Parliament has started trilogues on the general pharmaceutical legislation, which is another very important piece of legislation where it will be important to ensure a predictable incentive framework for innovative medicines. And also it's another tool where we can use to streamline and harmonize regulatory requirements, which, as you said, MEP, it doesn't mean cutting everything, but it just means make things easier, harmonizing different requirements and avoid duplications that are the kind of things that often kill companies with limited resources, both financial resources and human resources.
We will return to the topic of finances later on in the debate, where we will also discuss the multi-annual financial framework. But for now, let's return to the Critical Medicines Act. Mr. Maheas, If production were to shift more to Europe, what would be the effects on prices?
It's a good question. We haven't looked at it like this. I think if you want to produce something out of Europe, you need to acknowledge that at some point the price of commodities, because generic medicines are commodities, so they are priced like basic goods that are needed, like food, for instance. So the price needs to reflect the production conditions. And I think here we are in a market economy, and I like what you said. I mean, what we would like to see is a market that works, a market that rewards the fact that we are in Europe, a market that rewards the fact that we invest into security of supply, and also that we produce super high quality medicines. So the level of control we have, the level of rules we have to follow, including environmental rules, and it's not a complaint, it's just a fact. And this needs to be reflected somehow in the price. Otherwise, we end up in a kind of schizophrenic situation where we have more and more rules to follow, and we follow them. But at the same time, the price doesn't reflect that. And the consequence is more consolidation of the industry and offshoring. So we have to deconstruct that and go the other way around.
Ms. Ostrihoňová, theoretically, would it be acceptable for medicines to get a bit more expensive, but for the price of making sure that they are manufactured in Europe, and if a crisis hits, like the COVID crisis, we have access to medicines?
Look, this is a question, a very hypothetical question, which I can't answer because it is very different from member state to member state also. I believe that what we need to discuss is how to make them not more expensive, but available. That's the hardest question. I understand about everything that we're talking about, simplifying the business area for the pharma companies, mid, small scale, all of them. But I still feel like there has to be more leeway on the side of the pharmaceutical companies as well, because we are trying to simplify the environment. And from what I see, how the pharmaceutical companies are doing with their business and with their financial results, I don't feel like they suffer too much. Correct me if I'm wrong. But so I don't really see an imminent threat of rising the prices. What I see as a problem is if there are countries in the European Union, which should be a union of all 27 countries, where some medicines are available readily and some aren't. Of course, we can't fix everything from the European Union because, as we know, healthcare is primarily an issue of member states. But we can set some of the rules or some of the regulations. From what I see here, what could help is even just, and that is something we could do on the European level, is just being more transparent, for instance, in the stockpiling issue, which is also part of the Critical Medicines Act, to actually tell the member states they have to tell us how much of what they have and whether in a time of crisis, they could be willing to share with those who are in the same union but don't have the medicine, and then vice versa. So I don't think we should just talk about price, which is very important, obviously, and we want the companies to be able to produce quality medicines and to produce them preferably here in Europe, because we can say that it's easier and cheaper if it's produced elsewhere, like in Asia, but then we can't really depend, as we've said a few times here. If there is a shortage, it's harder to fix it, and it takes time in a crisis to fix it. So I believe this is about the dialogue that has to start in the European Union, I think, but then it has to continue on the member state level, because the differences, as I said in the beginning, in the healthcare and in their healthcare budgets are so vast between the member states. The healthcare shortages, the workers in the healthcare shortages, which we get to later, those are immense. So there are many, many issues that have to be tackled hand in hand and at the same time.
Mr. Maheas, you wanted to comment?
No, I wanted to give maybe just two numbers in terms of pricing for generic medicine. So again, going to antibiotics, but it's comparable to many other therapeutic areas. So generic antibiotics in Europe, if you take a country like Germany, which is not the poorest country in Europe, a treatment with antibiotics would cost 17 cents a day. If you compare that with any coffee you buy across Europe, if you add a little bit of skim milk, it's really nothing. We can say it otherwise. It's not even the price of a pack of M&Ms. So I think here we're discussing a range of prices that are not comparable, obviously, with what innovation costs. And that's two very different situations and two very different business models. So I wanted to add that because, and again, Low prices is our job. This is what we're meant for. We bring the savings, we bring the low prices. It's just a question, how far can we go?
But then again, I agree with the fact that we have to invest as Europe into research and innovation. And I think it's also part of the competitiveness that we all talk about here. Because unless we do that, then all the innovative treatments won't be developed here. And then again, we'll have to get them from elsewhere.
Mr. Romanelli, a possible big topic of the future is pre-commercial procurement. How would that help? Is that a good way to go?
Well, there are a lot of talks on joint procurement or collaborative procurement of innovative medicines. And I will be very honest here in saying that to me, this is not the silver bullet. This is not the solution to improve access across all European member states. And I want to underline that there are, of course, huge access disparities, and this needs to be solved. And also industry has to play a key role and do their part in this. But I think the fundamental issue is that access is a national competence, first of all, and also pricing and reimbursement are decisions that are made at national level, and this depends on national budgets, national healthcare priorities, and there are a lot of these aspects that needs to be taken into account when we talk about access before talking about joint procurement. And if there are access issues in some countries, it's also because of this. And if we first don't solve the underlying issues of access, which also differ among different member states and can also differ a lot depending on the kind of innovative products we talk about, then joint procurement is not the solution. So we need to start by trying to understand and solve underlying issues at national level, and then we can really try to solve access and potentially explore any other collaborative procurements at the EU level. And we see in some specific cases like critical medical countermeasures where the EU has already been using joint procurement. And this is an area where, due to the specific characteristic of the products, EU joint procurement works well. It is different in other areas like orphan medicines or ATMPs, where indeed you need to have, for instance, besides the national budget, you need to have expertise at medical level, you need to have the right infrastructure to administer these products, and you have to have a patient population in some cases. Also, when we talk about orphan medicines, in many cases, there are other ways of reimbursement that are faster than the normal pricing and reimbursement pathway or even joint procurement. So all these elements should be taken into account and phased before considering joint procurement as the ultimate solution. If we manage to solve these things first, then we can really improve the problem. Otherwise, we risk just delaying access if we continue to have issues and roadblocks in these kind of existing barriers.
Ms. Ostrihoňová, do you agree? Joint procurement helped a lot during the COVID crisis. So how helpful is the instrument?
Well, I think it could be helpful. I understand that it's not the silver bullet, because I don't think there is a silver bullet in the healthcare system. Unfortunately, we all wish there were, and I wish we all found it, but there isn't. And it's a very complex issue, because we really have 27 different approaches. Then we can also discuss whether it really is a true single market if there are 27 different approaches, if to actually admit a medicine onto the market takes certain time in one country and 3 times that much time in the other country. And in the third country, it doesn't even get to, because yes, the thresholds are different. So I'm just trying to divide and conquer. There are things that could be done on the European level, and there are things that have to be done on the member state level. I understand that I don't think member states want to give out any more competencies. I think member states won't be very happy about joint procurement, maybe. Some of them would be, some of them wouldn't. That's where the debate has to start. What we see, the facts are on the ground, is that the level of access to medicines is in the entire common European sphere in the EU 27 is very unequal. And any inequality leads to problems. And if we're trying to think of how to boost European competitiveness, how to boost our security, I strongly believe that we have to start also with the healthcare. And yes, it can be on talking with the national member states. I come from Slovakia, where the prices of medicines is quite low compared to other countries. But then again, we see the phenomenon that some of the medicines won't even get to Slovakia, because the pharmaceutical companies would rather sell them to a bigger, more rich country, which is able to pay more for them. Is this okay on the market level? Yes. On the solidarity level, we might talk about whether the pharma, the directive that is being of the pharma legislation that is being proposed right now and being discussed, whether that should address somehow that if we know that there is a shortage of something, whether it should be possible to discuss with the pharma company, okay, I know it's way less expensive in this country than in others. You have an obligation to deliver it anyways, because healthcare and medicines isn't regular articles. I think it's actually something that can kill people or save people. The lack of can kill. So I think it's a dialogue that is lacking, and we are trying to foster it. And with the CMA, with the Critical Medicines Act, I'm very happy that it's getting quite heated and it's getting quite interesting, because then it could also spill over to the national member states, and each and every one of them will have to say, okay, are we going to harmonize some of the rules? Are we going to harmonize some of the procedures? Or are we going to stick to our own every single time? When the European Medicines Agency gets some medicine approved, how is it going to be easier for all 27 member states to actually have it on the market? Or are we going to go through the same set of regulations and rules and put another hindrance on the market level?
A lot of the language in the Critical Medicines Act focuses on recommendations and guidances for the member states. So is that a good way to go, or should there be maybe something more directive?
Well, this is what we're talking about. If healthcare is primarily the responsibility of member states, we have limited competences on the European level. Should it be different? We can discuss in another episode, I think. But for now, we have to deal with what we have. So we can give recommendations. We can talk about tips. We can talk about the exchange of information. That's what I said. Even just making the stockpiles more transparent in the EU member states could help in a potential crisis if there comes. We know that there is enough of it in one country and there is a lack of it in another country. It might foster a more fast and a more efficient exchange of these goods, because it is medicines, that it is medical products. It is something that we need, all of us, in the E27. So we can't, jump the gun and say we're going to regulate and legislate in areas that we cannot and we don't have the competence to. But yes, we can talk about it as a European problem, as a competitiveness problem, as a security problem if there is lack of available medicines. I think all of us can agree here on that.
Mr. Maheas, so would transparency help? Is that the way to go?
Sorry?
Would transparency, as Ms. Ostrihoňová mentioned, help?
Yeah.
Is that a good solution?
Not only transparency, and yes, I mean, the treaty is the treaty. So there are things that member states
Can and
do,
do,
and there are things that the EU can do. But the EU can do a lot already. And I think that's the Critical Medicines Act, again, is a starting point. And just 2 examples. So procurement, yes, procurement is an EU competence, and the EU can define how you procure medicines. And for off-patent medicines, it's about 30-40% of all medicines. Most medicines that go to hospital, for instance, they are tendered. They go through procurement procedure. And here you can say, well, it's not just the price. So you have to add other criteria and check if the supply is secured, if the environmental norms are followed, or if we go beyond expectations, and this should be rewarded. And this is EU competence. Now, coming back to transparency and stockpiling, very interesting topic. Again, we are in a single market. Goods should move freely. And maybe there is a bit of, first, transparency. So we should know what are the requirements member state by member state. And maybe what has been required by some member states, the biggest one, France and Germany, is excessive. Maybe this has consequences on the free movement of goods and on access for patients in other member states. And this is where we have the Critical Medicines Act, where we don't have a lot, actually.
We'll have it at some point.
It would be good to have more transparency, but I think we can go beyond transparency and we could really look into real control of what is the impact on the free movement of goods. Because what we've seen when there is a shortage, most shortages of medicines, they are local, means that they affect 1 or 2 countries maximum. And if we look, we are a European-wide company. Usually, if we look, and EMA, the European Medicines Agency, is very good. And they call me directly and they say, well, look, we've got this problem here. And then we look, oh, maybe we have a stock in Spain and we can reallocate the stock. But if you have a requirement to keep 6 months stock in Germany, 4 months in France, and you're not allowed to move that stock because otherwise you're going to get a fine, and not a small one, a big one, then there is a problem here. And this is something that I'm very happy to hear that the European Parliament is looking at, because it's an imbalance in the market that affects patient access in other member states. You try to solve the problem somewhere, but you create more problems.
Let's move on. Mr. Romanelli, a key part of the Critical Medicines Act is also guidance on state aid. So how key is that for smaller manufacturers?
Well, I think that when we talk about state aid or important project of common European interest, that there is something that has been explored lately, and other financing, this can be very, very important. I think we need to be cautious in two ways. The first one is to, especially in the context of the Critical Medicines Act, most of this state aid will be guaranteed to developers, to manufacturers of critical medicines. So it's not really the case of our members. So I cannot give really a strong opinion, but I think that, so that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that generally when we talk about state aid or EPCI, AIs, and also generally funding, what is important is that the right budget is allocated. Because if we want to support companies of any size to manufacture, to expand their sites in Europe or to manufacture further in Europe, we need to make sure that the right scale of support is given. So if we don't put the right amount of financial support, or if we don't carve out the state aid in the right way, the effect will be limited. Then in that case, we risk also not using properly the public resources that we have. So it's more about this, in my view.
Ms. Ostrihoňová, how will the Critical Medicines Act change the rules for state aid when it comes to medicine?
Well, we don't have a definite answer yet, so I can't really answer that. I will tell you once we have an agreement on the Critical Medicines Act. I really don't want to assume. But as was said, I think that could be agreed with. And I think we should also think about strategic partnerships, where it's public-private partnerships, where again, it goes also along the lines of investment into research and development, which is also one of the priorities of the current Commission as well. So we will see where the state aid debate goes. And again, it's also on the agreement of the member states. And it's also on their capabilities of how much they can actually pay and on the budgets they allocate, because we know that even the budgets that go to healthcare systems in the EU27 are vastly different, from few percent to a lot. So if there isn't a harmony in that, we can't say this is the proposed state aid for everyone. Again, it isn't the one size fits all.
Mr. Maheas, if rules for state aid change, could that also make you change your decisions when it comes to investments?
So, I mean, state aid, there are rules to control what member states give and how they can support companies with public money. So the first thing you need is public money. And that is already a scarce resources. We've tested the system. My company has tested the system. And today, the way state aid works is not really adapted, I would say, to the reality of the off-patent industry. So there is a bias in favor of innovation when what we do is also innovative, but not considered as innovative as bringing a new medicine. It's not just the product that comes out of the factory that is the innovation. It's also how you build your factory, how much artificial intelligence you put into your factory. So I think that could be better captured by the new state aid framework. And also what we've seen is that the timeline is sometimes entirely disconnected from the reality of an investor. It took more than 3 years for us to receive the green light for a very, very limited amount of money, and that's not okay. So I think state aid is just the one thing that can help and facilitate investors like my company to keep investing in Europe. It's not the only decision, or this is not the only decisive factor, but it can be the one that makes the difference. So I think it's important to have it. But again, we go back to the real question is that how much money is available and how serious Europe and member states are serious when they say they want to keep manufacturing in Europe and even reshore manufacturing in Europe. It needs a little bit of finance behind it, let's put it that way.
Over at Medicines for Europe, you have been very vocal about the negative effects of the wastewater treatment directive. which you say might end up raising prices of generics in Europe. Doesn't it go against what the Critical Medicines Act aims to achieve?
So we're not against the wastewater treatment directive, but within and getting cleaner water is an objective that we all share as an industry. This is what we have. We already implement the level of treatment that is required by the directive on a manufacturing plant. The wastewater treatment directive introduces a financing mechanism that affects our products because of the big volumes we have in a way that was not foreseen in the impact assessment. I just had figures this morning from the Czech Republic. The European Commission said it would cost 14 million a year in the Czech Republic, 1/4. Now, the estimate from the Czech government just now is 250 million a year for the industry. For a country like the Czech Republic, it's 10% of the total healthcare budget. This is not sustainable. So what I mean is that you cannot put on patients alone to pay for the upgrade of the wastewater treatment. Because if you do that, there is a risk for patients. And patients, they are not choosing to take a pill. If you have cancer, if you have diabetes, it's not a choice. You take the medicines that are prescribed because you want to get better. So you will not change the behavior of patients because the wastewater directive is a tax on being a patient. And this is what is wrong. And this is where I think the European Parliament, the Council last week, but also the European Commission said, look, let's look again at the numbers because the numbers clearly, they are not right. Let's pause and let's sit together and to see how we finance the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plants across Europe.
Mr. Romanelli, will that affect you as well, or is that an issue for the generics?
No, I think it's an issue also for innovative companies. And while I'm not an expert on the subject, I think it's, of course, an issue that also affects more companies that develop medicines that are more of common use, even innovative medicines. So it might be slightly less for low volume medicines because of the numbers, but still it's an issue. And as Arnaud said, it's important to take it into account and also realize that it could have important financial consequences that the companies need to take, and that could also have spillover effects indirectly on patient access in the end.
Ms. Ostrihoňová, hearing all that, I believe also the industry was definitely in contact. So what is the EP's stance on changing the directive?
Well, the European Parliament recently called in a resolution on the upcoming water resilience strategy for a fresh impact assessment. So there will be a fresh impact assessment. I don't think it necessarily is going to lead to reopening of the legislation, but we'll see. The Commission says they have no plans to do so. But we called as the European Parliament for an impact assessment. Also, what I've seen and what I've studied is that there are deadlines that are being pushed because of the conversations with the stakeholders from 2033 to 2035. What I recall, there are some derogations for certain newer member states, which would be even more affected. So there is a conversation going. I think there was a conversation going on. There was some feedback given also on the part of the lawmakers, of the regulators. But then at the end of the day, we come to the point that it is 90% of the micropollutants that are given by the pharmaceutical companies. So there has to be a price to pay. And I don't think it's irrelevant to say that it is the responsibility or the co-responsibility of the pharma companies. I don't think it's being punishable for the patient. It's not punishing the patient. It's punishing the one who does it. And I think that the Commission and the European institution have shown willingness in talking about this, when there's a lot of pushback. There are court cases, from what I recalled, to talk about, okay, maybe let's make the targets less timely, maybe give more time. But I think that the main objective, the goal, is for us to have clean water everywhere in Europe, because that is also a healthcare risk if we don't. And then you have to look why it isn't as clean as it could be, and then go to the subject who is responsible. So I think the logical standpoint behind it is good, and we can talk about the different specifics that the stakeholders, mainly the pharma companies, don't like.
The time is ticking, so let's move on to another subject. The multi-annual financial framework is supposed to be introduced by the Commission in July. Should health be one of the key priorities?
It definitely should be one of the key priorities, but as we hear and see now, there are a lot of priorities. And the financial framework is going to be very tough to come up with. From what I am pushing for and from what we, I think, in the Sant committee, most of us are pushing for is to not. I don't think we'll be able to get more money to be very realistic, but at least to keep the money that we have for health, because obviously every single sector is endangered because we have to cut on certain expenditures. We're going to have to put more into security, pay back some loans. So obviously there is a push and pull, but we are advocating very strongly for if we cannot get more money, then we at least have to keep the money that we already have allocated in the budgets. And plus, we need to look for our own resources. There's really no way around it.
Mr. Maheas, is that the goal, to keep the money at least if we cannot get more?
Yes, I think it's keeping the money, but also I think in the structure of the next financial perspective, it's important that there is a line that is dedicated to health. Because if you make a big pot, then it's probably harder to find it, even if the Commission tells us, oh, it's here. But in 2, 3, 5 years' time, then maybe it's hard to find. So let's have a dedicated line for healthcare, so that we know where it is. And I agree with you, the amount of money that is available is not unlimited, but at least there is a clarity and a certainty of where the money sits.
I think we can agree on the predictability factor. That is what we need to know. That is good for the stakeholders. That is good for the legislators. That is good for the patients at the end of the day. So I think we should really have in mind when forming the budget, but also when forming any healthcare policies on the European Union level, how to boost the predictability, because that is where it starts. That is where everyone knows where they're headed, and there's less of a chaos, and then less last minute, makeshift solutions.
Mr. Romanelli, what are your expectations from the next long-term budget, and why is it important?
Well, I agree that predictability will be a key word in the budget, as also generally for what concerns smaller companies. It's important that sufficient budget will be allocated for healthcare projects, and this can cover various healthcare projects. I would mention a couple of them, even though the list is non-exhaustive, because there are really a lot of healthcare priorities that we need to support. But thinking from our perspective, we think it's important to ensure there is enough budget for rare disease projects, and especially building on some of the existing projects that are proven successful and are already funded, like the European reference networks and ERDERA, that is about research and development in new rare disease treatments. And another important dossier will be also about funding for medical countermeasures that can help us also in public health crisis situations, including in the sector of IMR. There are, of course, many other priorities, but I would mention these two as two among many.
Well, I think we can also add the workforce shortages that I mentioned. We are preparing an own initiative report in the Sant committee that I'm also responsible for. So there is some sort of a part of a very crucial part of the budget. There should be, because if we don't have the people to treat, then there is really no way forward. We could have all the medicines, but if there are not the capacities. So it's really a multi-layered problem. And there are certain small things that may be small. I know it's not small, but it doesn't require as much money, improving some of the clinical trials, maybe allowing other country nationals to be also in the clinical trials in the European Union they can be from a person from one country can actually participate in a clinical trial in another country. That could really help. And also, I think since we are still a single market, we are a union of 27 countries. If there are, and I know we have certain level of that, but I think it can be enhanced. If there are treatments available in one of the EU countries, we should make them as accessible to all the other, and then we don't have to have it in all 27, because we won't be able to have a rare disease center in Slovakia, whereas we can have it maybe in Denmark. Okay, I'm coming up with examples. So let's facilitate the transfer of the patients. Let's help how to get the one patient. When it comes to rare diseases, it's really small numbers. I think it could be operated and it could be run more effectively and more smoothly than it is right now. And it doesn't really require as much more money. It's more of a management, more of a transfer, transparency again, policies that could be enhanced and could be improved. and we can see a major improvement, because I see that there is certain countries collaborate together well, but it's harder if the country is further apart, if it's further down in Europe, if it's not a neighboring country, how to transfer the patient, who to contact. So I think this is also the role of the European Union, to facilitate and foster these connections and make them easier in our own union.
Well, we will see what the proposal will look like in July and how the negotiations will go. But for now, this is all the time we have here. Thank you all for coming, and see you next time.